For the last 8 weeks, this channel has been running a series called Autism and Relationships, about how autistic and non-autistic people can improve our understanding of each other and communicate better. Most of them have looked at a common preconception about autistic people and sought to explain or challenge it. The next episode will be about the concept of autistic black and white thinking. But before we go into that, there's a more serious and contentious subject we need to talk about. If autistic people think about some things in polarised black and white terms, we're not the only ones. What about neurotypical black and white thinking about autism? The word autism is far better known than when I was first diagnosed late last century. Since then, we've seen the adoption of the autism spectrum as standard practice, and even the rise and fall of Asperger syndrome in the diagnostic manuals. There's been an explosion in the availability of information, and countless charities devoted to helping autistic children in particular have sprung up all over the world. However, public understanding of autism and autistic people has barely moved beyond the idea of it being a debilitating disability that affects children. Despite prolific debate and rewrites, the basic diagnostic criteria of the autism spectrum have changed little in nearly 30 years. Availability of diagnosis and provision of services are woefully inadequate, and yet there are many charities, pharmaceutical companies, governments and even celebrity pundits shouting about an autism epidemic and demanding action. If there is an autism epidemic, it's not in the numbers of people being recognised as being autistic. It is an epidemic of black and white thinking about autism across the world. Almost everything in the media about autism or autistic people is negative, or contrasted against a negative point of view. It's portrayed as an affliction, a tragedy, a blight on the lives of parents and a profound disadvantage to the people who have to endure being autistic. Inspiration porn about autistic people is common, celebrating the courageous way some of us have overcome our limitations. Even now, ordinary people like myself are pitied by our peers, and our successes judged as being despite our autism rather than because of our talents. Almost all of this is based on misunderstandings and willful misrepresentation of what being autistic really entails, which actually perpetuate the conditions that make so many autistic lives difficult. It's a black and white attitude. Not autistic equals good, autistic equals bad. In a previous film, I talked about some of the reactions I and other autistic people get when we reveal that we're autistic. There's so many variations on the same theme. People suggest that we might only be mildly autistic, or that we're very high functioning. They insist we must be the exception to the rule and play down the idea that we might be just plain and simply autistic, because they've been conditioned to think that being autistic is a bad thing. It rarely occurs to them that we might actually be happy being just who we are, and that if we weren't autistic we might not benefit from half of the skills, emotional insight or sensory experiences that enrich our lives. The very idea that autistic people could be happy with our differences simply does not compute, because the tragedy narrative is so entrenched in modern society. It's almost as if they believe that failure is written into our DNA. This is the essence of society's black and white thinking about autism. It can only be a bad thing requiring medicines or therapy to mitigate, never something we're okay with or even proud of. Adults seeking autism diagnosis are often told not to by their family and friends. They get asked why they want to be labelled, and the potential disadvantages are pointed out to them. The idea that it may be a relief we actually want in our lives, a way of contextualising differences we've always recognised, seems insane to them. Where does this idea come from? Why is it so hard for myself and the many other creators and advocates out there to switch the narrative around? Unfortunately, it comes back to that which has been cited for centuries as the root of all evil: money. As long as the public perception of autism is kept in the dark ages of fear and tragedy, there's money to be made from autism. It's not autistic people footing the bill, it's our parents and our governments. Whilst autistic people are the victims in the long term, it's our parents and our taxes that pay the financial price, supporting wasted efforts to cure us of the incurable. Special diets, drug therapies, exercise programs and spurious educational tools are the thin end of the wedge. Quacks sell procedures that supposedly leach harmful chemicals out of our bodies, or peddle bleach to be injected up our ear ends to kill autism parasites. As horrifying as some of these are, none are more widespread or more financially draining than the pseudoscience of behaviourism. A while ago, I made a film about why autistic adults are almost universally united against ABA, or Applied Behaviour Analysis, along with all its renaming and image shifting to keep itself in business. ABA is actively promoted as a money-making opportunity and sold to prospective investors and practitioners on the strength of being unregulated, requiring little training, and having a healthy market in the form of desperate parents and social care services. It's a get-rich-quick industry, swindling billions of dollars out of the system and directly from families. There are conventions held, online seminars, glossy brochures and sophisticated advertising campaigns recruiting more and more converts with the promise of easy money. If ever it were to become known that the majority of autistic people alive today are adults, many of whom have succeeded in life without any form of intervention and against a background of bullying and low expectations, the flow of money for their interventions would be cut off. They invest millions into promoting their distorted view of autism, conducting spurious research into behaviours they claim to be abnormal, which in fact harm no one. They lobby parliaments to secure government funding and infiltrate universities to engage in cherry-picked research to reinforce the idea that autistic people are broken. Let's take one of the most commonly accepted ideas that they want us to believe, that most autistic people have some form of intellectual disability, and that those of us who don't, the ones they deem as high-functioning, are a troublesome minority. It's accepted by the mainstream as correct. They see a dividing line between people like me leading independent lives who they call high-functioning, and every other autistic who they describe as anything from low-functioning to severe. So-called severe autism is the profiteers' main target, although they still like to scare parents into thinking that every autist can benefit from a spot of reprogramming. When they talk of severe, they cite the high prevalence of intellectual disabilities within the autistic population. The more pronounced the intellectual disability, the more severe their autism, and the more their dubious help is needed. They frequently justify this using studies conducted in what are essentially captive populations. Autistic people who have been in one way or another institutionalised because their parents felt unable to cope, or the authorities put the kids away for their own reasons. As you might expect, the institutions used to obtain these figures house a significant number of people with intellectual disabilities, which, they tell us, is fair because there's few other resources where there are enough autistic people together to study. The figures they publish from these studies then get recycled by the parents who are their financial victims, and organisations attempting to justify the need for drastic interventions and even eugenics. They even use them against autistic adults. They talk over us alongside dubious experts who use their qualifications and bogus statistics as battering rams to knock down any barriers to their pseudoscientific propaganda. Over the years, figures have been quoted that range from a third of autistic people up to 4/5 of us having severe or profound intellectual disabilities. More often than not, they will just say most autistic people and elaborate with comments about toileting, self-harm and inappropriate or violent behaviour intended to embarrass us. But there are other ways of getting such information. Why look at institutions and hospitals when there are other sources of information that are more comprehensive? What if there were a national survey that citizens were legally obliged to answer, which included questions about autism and intellectual disability. You could get a representative sample of a whole country. Well, that's exactly what we have in the Scottish census from 2011, and a fellow advocate, Anne Memmot, has compiled and broken down the data. Let's take a look at the figures. According to the census, there were just over 25,000 diagnosed autistic people living in Scotland on Census Day. So, based on the estimates we get from the black and white common knowledge of intellectual disability in autistic people, how many of that 25,000 would have severely or profoundly disabled intellectual capacity? If we're in that somewhere between a third and 4/5 territory, it should be a figure between 8,000 and 20,000. That doesn't look right. Let me check and refresh. Maybe there's a couple of zeros missing. Nope. That's it. Less than 1%. Rather than 4/5 of all of us, it's actually 3/4 of 1%. What if we broaden it a bit? How about we include mild and moderate intellectual disability? That's everyone with any kind of diagnosable intellectual disability at all. That's got to be at least 8,000. Oh, it's less than half that. It's actually only about 15% of the total, around 1/7 of us, which means that 6 in every 7 autistic people has at least what would be considered a statistically normal intellect. In general terms, people without intellectual disability are considered able to lead lives without significant assistance. Only those in the severe or profound category are deemed to require constant assistance or supervision, and those who are mild or moderate may expect to need part-time support. So, on the basis of intellectual disability alone, one of the favourites of scaremongers, only 1 in 130 or so autistic people actually needs the full-time care they want us to believe at least 1 in 3 of us require. Even if we factor in everyone with any kind of intellectual disability, we still only get to less than half of their most conservative estimate. When you actually look at things more closely, using freely available information, the picture is very different from the black and white view believed by most people and promoted by the charlatans who profit from fear. This is why people express surprise when I tell them I'm autistic. They're led to believe that most autists are nothing like me, and that people like myself with intelligence and independent lives are rare exceptions, whereas we're actually the norm. If the common knowledge about intellectual disabilities and autism is so very wrong about just this one very black and white detail, how many others are wrong? That's why channels like this and the thousands of other bloggers, podcasters and campaigners exist. We're doing our best to communicate a different view of autism and autistic life. We're people who think differently, not profoundly incapable of living productive lives. We are not, on the whole, disabled by autism, but by attitudes to autistic people and prejudice from those in authority. We do occasionally need support, but not in the manner that's being forced down our throats. Of course, there's more things that can disable an autistic person other than intellectual disabilities. We can have sensory disabilities, mental health problems, epilepsy, or like myself, digestive problems and arthritis. We could have specific learning disabilities like dyslexia or dyscalculia, or be dyspraxic. But none of these are caused by or exclusive to autism. When combined with autism and the black and white prejudices of a society that demands we communicate on their terms rather than making the effort to meet us in the middle, they can be far more disabling than they need be. There are autistic people who need others to care for them at all times, and they and their carers deserve every support we can give them. But they are not the majority as we are led to believe. We ask society to give them the help and the financial support they need and make the effort to understand the rest of us so that we can lead the lives we're capable of. Black and white attitudes to autism and autistic people can be traced to misrepresentations from way back in the last century and are desperately in need of updating. there's mounting evidence suggesting the number of autistic people in the world may be 3 or 4 times what we currently think, since the vast majority of autistic adults remain undiagnosed. It's likely that we won't have a complete picture of how many of us there really are until long after my lifetime. We can only hope that by then we will have moved beyond black and white thinking and learned how to treat autistic people as humans with different needs, rather than burdens to both parents and society. Thank you for watching. Over here on the left you can subscribe to the channel to learn more about autistic life and issues, and over here on the right you can click on another Autistamatic film, or visit Autistamatic.com.